Today we will be reviewing radians, namely the 6 trig functions applied to radians. Here's an example. We have to find the 6 trig functions for 5 pi over 6. Sine, cosine, and tangent. The first thing we have to remember is where 5 pi over 6 is. Let's count together. 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6. There it is. We can go ahead and draw a little triangle. Label the short side and the long side. And now we can answer the question. Sine of pi over 6, 5 pi over 6. Sine is the opposite side, 1/2. Cosine is the adjacent side. Negative radical 3 over 2. Notice the negative, just because the negative radical 3 over 2 goes in the negative direction. And then tangent is opposite over adjacent, which is 1/2 over negative radical 3 over 2. Rationalize all of that and you should get negative radical 3 over 3. Try that. Now if you notice, the directions say 6 trig functions. We've only done 3. Here are the other 3. Cosecant, secant, and cotangent. That was from the very first day we started trigonometry, but they're not hard to do. Cosecant, this first one, is the reciprocal of sine. So whatever your sine answer is, you just flip it. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So whatever your answer is for cosine, flip it. But notice when you flip it, you have a radical in the denominator. Rationalize that by multiplying the top and the bottom by radical 3. And you should get negative 2 radical 3 over 3. And then finally, cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent. But then again, we have a radical on the denominator, so rationalize it by multiplying the top and the bottom by radical 3, and you should get negative radical 3. Let's do another one. Let's find the 6 trig functions for negative 5 pi over 4. Start off with the first 3. Let's go ahead and find where negative 5 pi over 4 is. When it's over 4, we're going to go halfway in between, in the opposite direction. Here's 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, and negative 5 pi over 4. That's where it is. Draw in our triangle. Label the legs. Radical 2 over 2 and negative radical 2 over 2. And now we can answer the questions. Sine is opposite side. That is radical 2 over 2. Cosine is the adjacent, the negative radical 2 over 2. And then tangent is opposite over adjacent, which turns out to be just negative 1. Let's do the other 3 trig functions. Cosecant is the inverse of sine, so flip the answer. When you flip it, we do have a radical in the denominator. We fix it by multiplying the top and the bottom by radical 2. Same thing with secant. Flip cosine's answer and rationalize it. And then for cotangent, if you flip a -1, it'll just be a -1. Okay, this is our last example for the day. It does say tricky. We have to find the 6 trig functions for 8 pi over 16. Alright, it is tricky because we have to reduce 8 pi over 16 first. That is pi over 2. Now, if you don't know where pi over 2 is, and you don't know that counting method, we would change pi over 2 to 2 pi over 4, because we can count the problems that are over 4. Let's count. 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4. So there it is. It's the same thing as pi over 2. It's also the same thing as 8 pi over 16. Okay. Now let's go ahead and solve the questions. Notice we cannot draw a triangle from this point. So when you cannot, remember there was another way by using the points. 0, 1. 0, 1. 0 being the x, and then 1 being the y value. So if we do sine is usually opposite, but since there's no opposite, it's also considered the y value. Sine is always the y value. In this case, it's 1. Cosine is usually the adjacent, but since there's no adjacent, we also know that cosine is the x value. In this case, 0. And tangent is the opposite over adjacent, but in this case, it's going to be the y value over the x value. 1 over 0, which we all know is undefined. Alright, let's do the last 3 trig functions. Cosecant, all you have to do is flip your sign answer, and that's just 1. For secant, if you flip that answer, we get undefined, because if you flip a 0, the 0 will end up in the denominator, which makes it undefined. And then if you flip the tangent answer, you get 0 over 1, which is just 0. Alright, I hope that wasn't too bad, but that's all we have for today.